The HOA tried to bulldoze my wetlands. One flood overnight wiped out their entire project. I had lived on my property for over a decade, and every day I had awakened to the serene symphony of nature that seemed almost sacred in its rhythm. The wetlands stretching beyond my view with reeds bending gently in the wind, frogs croaking in their eternal chorus, dragonflies darting like living jewels over the mirrored surfaces of shallow pools, and the occasional heron standing silently, its reflection fractured in the water beneath it. All of it a delicate ecosystem that had existed long before any of us, and I felt a profound responsibility to protect it, a quiet pride in knowing that my stewardship had preserved a small sanctuary in a world increasingly consumed by asphalt, concrete, and the relentless march of human ambition. Yet that peace, that sense of harmony, was shattered on an ordinary Tuesday when I noticed the deep rumble of engines in the distance, a sound entirely foreign to the gentle lapping of water against cattail roots. And as I walked toward the edge of my land, the smell of freshly turned soil and diesel fuel filled my nostrils, and I saw it, the unmistakable sight of heavy machinery, bulldozers, backhoes, and dump trucks, methodically tearing into the land I had come to know as home, leaving trails of churned mud and splintered branches in their wake, their presence jarring against the soft green and brown palette of the wetlands. The once calm horizon now dotted with twisted tree trunks and the eerie silence of displaced birds, the air thick with dust and the shrill metallic cries of chainsaws, all blending into a jarring cacophony that seemed almost hostile, and my heart sank as I realized the truth. My HOA, the very organization I had reluctantly been a part of, known in the neighborhood for its petty rules and overbearing oversight, had decided that a road would run right through the core of my protected wetlands, a decision made without notice, consultation, or consideration, the type of bureaucratic arrogance that masquerades as community service while trampling over the delicate balance of nature and tradition. And as I approached the foreman, a stocky man in a neon vest who barely looked up from his clipboard, I asked with as much calm as I could muster, "What is going on here?" And he shrugged, his expression blank before muttering, "It's for community access. You'll thank us later." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity, to shake him until he understood that later would never justify the destruction they were committing in the present. But instead, I felt the cold surge of anger rising in my chest, an anger that had been tempered for years by patience and a respect for civility, yet now could not be contained. For generations before me had carefully tended this land, preserving the wetlands, the streams, the hidden hollows where salamanders and crayfish thrived. And now it was being obliterated under the guise of convenience, and I could see the dark water of a small pond that had served as a breeding ground for countless species being filled with mud and debris, its surface fractured and opaque, the air above it thick with the cries of displaced frogs, the occasional bird squawking in alarm, and I realized that if I did nothing, in a matter of hours, the history of this land would be reduced to mud and machinery, a stark testament to human hubris. And I felt a visceral need to act, to stand as a barrier between them and the fragile life that called these wetlands home, and I confronted the foreman again, my voice steadier now despite the storm of emotion inside me. "You do not have permission to be on my property. Stop this immediately." He looked at me with a mixture of irritation and amusement, as if the concept of private stewardship in the face of HOA bureaucracy were a joke, and when I demanded to speak to someone higher up, he made a dismissive wave toward the distant offices, muttering something about paperwork being in order, and that I wouldn't understand, the implication being clear. The rules had been rewritten without my knowledge, the invisible lines of authority drawn over the land I had loved, and I felt a chill as I realized this was not just about a road, but about control, about a small but determined group of individuals asserting dominance over a landscape that had never belonged to anyone but nature. And I stood there, fists clenched, boots sinking into the wet soil, surveying the destruction that had begun in my absence, the mud smeared across once pristine banks. The trees lopped haphazardly as if by a giant hand that did not care about life. The shrubs crushed under the weight of machinery, and I felt a surge of determination that surprised even me. A certainty that I would not allow this to continue, that I would fight, legally if necessary, morally always, to protect what had been entrusted to me. And in that moment, I imagined the wetlands as they were before the intrusion, alive with the quiet majesty of countless creatures. The soft hum of life in perfect balance, and I promised myself that I would see it restored, that no blade of grass, no bird, no insect would fall without my protest, that the legacy of this land, of the generations who had nurtured it, would not be erased by arrogance or bureaucracy. And as I walked back toward my house to gather documents, photographs, and evidence of the encroachment, I could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on my shoulders, heavy yet righteous. And I knew that the coming days would be filled with confrontation, with letters, with meetings, perhaps even with legal battles. But the wetlands were worth every struggle, worth every sleepless night, for in them lay the heartbeat of life itself, a rhythm that no road, no HOA, no human whim should ever silence. And as the sun began to dip behind the distant tree line, casting long shadows over the churned earth, I stood on the boundary of my land and silently vowed. I would not yield, I would not compromise, and I would not let the encroachment go unchallenged. For this was more than land, more than ownership. It was heritage, sanctuary, and my soul intertwined with the green, quiet, vibrant life that no machine could replace. The moment I realized that confrontation was inevitable, I picked up the phone with a mixture of determination and frustration, calling the HOA board first, speaking through lines of bureaucracy to voices that seemed rehearsed in placating residents rather than protecting the land they claimed to represent. Their words measured and vague, promises to look into it, offered with a nonchalance that only deepened my resolve. And when that yielded nothing, I reached out to the local environmental office. My voice strained but firm as I described the destruction I had witnessed, the uprooted trees, the draining marshes, the delicate pools of water now filled with mud, every syllable weighed with urgency, and the official on the other end made notes, assured me inspections would happen, and I felt a flicker of hope. Yet deep down I knew bureaucracy would move at its own slow, indifferent pace while my land was being systematically desecrated. So I escalated further, contacting the county inspector directly, providing GPS coordinates, photographs I had taken in the hours since the first machines appeared, images that documented every trench, every rut, every displaced stone, the creeping destruction captured in stark, undeniable clarity, and I waited anxiously for responses, checking my phone obsessively. But as days passed, the machines continued their work, bulldozers carving paths through the wetlands with relentless efficiency, dump trucks depositing gravel and earth in lines that would soon harden into a road, backhoes slicing into the soil as if my protests were meaningless, and I realized that official warnings were just words on paper, that their effect in the field was almost non-existent, and my frustration turned into action, into meticulous documentation, into vigilance. For I knew that every moment counted, that every second the machinery operated without interruption was a moment closer to irreversible damage. And so I began a new routine, rising before dawn, walking the boundary lines, camera in hand, notebook ready, recording not only photographs but written observations of machine positions, operator names when visible, timestamps of when digging began and ended, the depth of each trench, the approximate volume of displaced soil, sketching maps of the area affected, noting changes in water flow and animal behavior, and sometimes I stayed hidden in the trees, watching from a distance, notebook pressed against my chest, as if my very presence could bear witness to the assault and hold it accountable. And the nights were no less arduous, filled with restless packing through the darkened property, flashlight in hand, ears attuned to the low growl of engines, the scrape of metal against earth, the occasional shout from a worker, and I would record each sound, each movement, every detail that could serve as evidence, knowing that if legal action became necessary, nothing could be left unrecorded. and neighbors began to take notice, some glancing curiously over fences, whispering as they passed, cautious smiles of solidarity or murmurs of fear from those too intimidated by the HOA to act openly. And I felt both encouragement and loneliness in equal measure, knowing that support existed, yet also realizing that most would stay silent, too afraid of retribution to join the fight. And so I doubled my efforts, driving home after late-night surveillance to upload photos, organize them by date and location, cross-referencing them with official maps, emails to environmental officers detailing progress and destruction, sometimes including sketches of machine tracks and soil samples. And at times I stood on the small wooden deck overlooking the marsh, the evening mist curling around my boots, listening to the soft calls of frogs and the distant honk of geese, and I allowed myself a brief moment of reflection, the realization that what I was fighting for was more than my property. It was a sanctuary, a fragile ecosystem teetering between life and obliteration, and the thought of failure tightened in my chest. Yet I refused to yield, refused to let inertia or fear dictate the outcome. So I crafted detailed reports, labeling each photograph with precise time and location, describing soil displacement, water flow changes, vegetation damaged, nesting areas disturbed, noting which machines were operating where and when, sometimes using binoculars to watch operators, movements, recording license plates, and documenting the noise pollution affecting wildlife. And I became a chronicler of both destruction and resistance, transforming my home into a command center, walls lined with charts and maps, folders of photographs stacked meticulously, digital backups stored in multiple drives, emails sent to officials and news outlets to ensure accountability. And all the while, I continued my nightly vigils, trudging through the mud, flashlight beam cutting through darkness, capturing images of the machines frozen mid-destruction, shadows stretching across the wetlands like dark fingers, the still water reflecting the flashing lights of equipment and the rising moon. And I began to notice the subtle shifts in the wetlands. The way displaced water pooled unnaturally, creating new channels, the way reeds bent under unnatural weight, and the absence of frogs in places they had once thrived, all of it a visual and auditory testament to the assault, compelling me to continue, compelling me to ensure that nothing would escape documentation. For I understood that without evidence, words alone would fail, and the sense of urgency became a rhythm, my life temporarily consumed by the fight, waking, watching, recording, reporting. Each day a battle in its own right, and I often sat in my kitchen late at night, surrounded by photographs, maps, and reports, running my hands over the images as if to memorize every detail, every scar left on the land, every tiny sign of life still clinging to survival, and I could feel the tension building, the internal fire stoked by the stubbornness of the machines and the cold indifference of bureaucracy. Yet I reminded myself that persistence mattered, that history was on my side, and that the wetlands would not be sacrificed without resistance, and neighbors continued to watch from their yards, some nodding subtly, others crossing themselves in quiet prayer for me or for the land, the whispers carrying a mix of awe and fear. And I took courage from even the smallest gestures, knowing that standing alone was daunting, but standing firmly and prepared gave me power. And so I continued, every day, every night, documenting, photographing, taking notes, sending emails, calling officials again and again, checking responses, pushing for inspections, and even contacting local media, writing concise reports with photographs attached, laying out the narrative with undeniable evidence, while in the background the machines carved deeper trenches, their engines relentless, dumping soil, ripping roots, and slowly but surely shaping a road that would forever alter the landscape unless stopped. And through it all, I kept a meticulous record of time, date, actions, reactions, operator details, environmental changes, every conceivable metric that could prove not just encroachment but deliberate destruction. And as I paused one evening to catch my breath, watching the long shadows of machinery cast over the disturbed wetlands, I realized that this battle was no longer just about property lines. It was about preserving life, protecting heritage, and standing against the forces that believed efficiency and convenience justified devastation. And with that clarity, I made a vow to myself. I would not rest, I would not relent. I would document every action, confront every misstep, and fight relentlessly until the wetlands, the sanctuary that had nurtured generations, were defended. And I became a sentinel, a chronicler, a force that refused to be ignored, even as the road crept closer and the machinery roared louder, because I understood that to lose was to surrender a piece of history, a slice of life, and that was something I could never allow. And so the battle began in earnest, my resolve as unyielding as the marshes I was determined to save. The skis had been foreboding for days, a low gray blanket stretching across the horizon, whispering of rain, of storms, of the slow buildup of water that the wetlands had always absorbed with quiet efficiency. And when the first drops began to fall, I watched from my porch, binoculars in hand, as clouds darkened over the machinery still lodged stubbornly in my property, the bulldozers now partially coated with mud, their treads sliding in the softened earth. And I felt a flicker of hope that nature might intervene, but the hope was tinged with dread, for the rain did not fall evenly, but rather in sheets, turning the soil churned by human hands into a slippery, unstable mess. And within hours, I began to notice the first signs of catastrophe, water pooling unnaturally in areas where the road cut across natural channels, puddles merging into temporary ponds that displaced reeds and cattails, their roots now submerged and suffocating. Mudslides forming along the edges of disturbed embankments, soil giving way under the weight of vehicles and gravel, cascading downward in small avalanches, carrying with it the remains of plants that had anchored the earth for decades. And tiny gullies appeared, etched by the force of rainwater seeking paths it had never traveled before, twisting across what had once been a level, forgiving landscape, eroding the foundation of the road even as the machines continued to attempt progress. Their tires spinning uselessly in soft mud, wheels digging deeper and leaving behind trenches that would become channels for uncontrolled water flow. And I knew that this was not just a minor inconvenience but a warning, a message from the wetlands themselves. For nature has its own way of protesting disruption, of forcing humanity to respect balance. And I documented everything immediately, camera in hand, photographs capturing the rising water levels, the slipping soil, the flattened plants, the splintered branches that had once been upright sentinels in the marsh, and I annotated each image meticulously, writing notes of time, rainfall intensity, soil displacement, changes in water flow, the angle of the mudslides, the impact on wildlife, birds fleeing overhead in alarm, frogs croaking frantically in the shifting waters, small turtles washed into unfamiliar channels, their shells glistening wetly in the stormlight. And I sent the evidence to the HOA, to the environmental office, to the county inspector, crafting messages that explained in painstaking detail that wetlands act as natural sponges, absorbing water, slowing floodwaters, and preventing disaster, emphasizing that what they were witnessing was not just incidental but a direct consequence of their reckless road building. And I tried to make them understand that ignoring these warnings would be catastrophic. Yet their response was dismissive, almost comical in its arrogance. "A little water won't stop progress," they scoffed. Words dripping with condescension, as if the centuries of natural balance, the careful stewardship of life, the centuries of rainfall and absorption, could be overridden by human whim. And I felt a tight knot of anger and fear coil in my stomach, knowing that I could document and warn, but I could not stop the immediate damage alone. And as the rain intensified, I began to trek through the increasingly treacherous property, boots sinking into saturated mud, flashlight in one hand, camera in the other. Tracing the new water channels, measuring the depth of erosion gullies with a stick, knotting every displacement of soil, every uprooted reed, every splintered branch, and every bird or animal that had been displaced or trapped, snapping photographs of mudslides in progress, the churned earth slipping slowly downward, threatening to swallow small saplings, and I realized that the road was now a hazard in its own right, a scar that redirected water in destructive ways. concentrating floodwaters instead of allowing them to diffuse naturally, and I could see clearly how quickly this small intervention could escalate into major damage, threatening not only my property but the homes and lands of neighbors downstream, who relied on the wetlands' natural capacity to manage water. And as I watched the runoff carving new paths, I imagined what would happen if the rains continued for days, if the mudslides grew larger, if erosion weakened the road and machinery became trapped or toppled, potentially contaminating the wetlands further with fuel, hydraulic fluid, and debris. And my mind raced through worst-case scenarios, each more frightening than the last, envisioning collapsing banks, flooded neighboring yards, destroyed plant life, trapped wildlife, and the irreversible loss of habitats that had existed for generations. And I immediately sent urgent follow-up emails to the environmental office, highlighting the escalating danger, including comparative photos from the previous day, showing how much soil had shifted, how water levels had risen, how gullies had deepened, pleading for immediate inspection and intervention, while documenting the situation minute by minute as best I could, walking carefully along precarious slopes, sometimes slipping in the mud and catching myself on broken reeds, listening to the roar of rainwater as it found new courses through the disturbed landscape, feeling the vibrations of mud collapsing beneath my boots, the smell of wet earth and decomposing vegetation heavy in the air, the constant hum of storm energy vibrating through the ground, and every sight reinforced the urgency, the undeniable lesson that wetlands are not obstacles to human progress but living systems, complex and essential, and ignoring their warnings leads to consequences far beyond what casual observation can capture. And yet the HOA continued to press forward, their work trucks sliding uselessly in mud, operators scowling as progress slowed under the influence of forces they had no control over, their arrogance clashing violently with reality. And I could feel the tension between human ambition and natural law sharpening like a blade, the first signs of disaster already visible yet met with denial. And I documented everything with the obsessive precision of someone who knew the stakes, capturing not just photographs but video clips of water rushing along newly formed channels, of mud collapsing into trenches, of distressed birds flapping frantically through rain-smeared skis, annotating each clip with timestamps, observations, and environmental implications, knowing that each piece of evidence could be vital in a legal or regulatory confrontation. And as the hours passed, the rain showed no sign of letting up, small branches breaking under the weight of water, the soft soil at risk of sliding further, the road becoming more a hazard than an asset, and I continued to move carefully across my property, photographing, sketching, recording, measuring, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavy on my shoulders, the urgent knowledge that if nature's warnings went unheeded, irreversible damage would occur, and that human arrogance, even under the guise of progress, could trigger disasters that no paper permit could justify. And as night fell, the rain turned into a torrent, wind lashing across the wetlands, the newly formed channels carrying faster currents, mudslides accelerating as gravity and saturation took hold. And I knew that the next hours could prove decisive, that every moment mattered, that the wetlands were alive, signaling distress in ways impossible to ignore. And I could not stop documenting, could not stop warning, could not stop preparing to confront the impending consequences, because in the heart of the storm, the wetlands were speaking, and I was their only witness willing to listen. And as the lightning flickered across the sky, illuminating the churned mud, the half-formed road, the flattened reeds, and the struggling wildlife, I felt a deep, solemn resolve, knowing that when human arrogance meets the persistent voice of nature, consequences are inevitable. And I vowed that I would not let ignorance or arrogance override the lessons written in mud, water, and displaced life, and that the wetlands, ancient, delicate, resilient, and irreplaceable, would not be silenced, and my documentation, my warnings, my persistence would be the first line of defense against the disaster their progress threatened to unleash. Then it happened, as if the sky itself had decided to intervene, a massive storm sweeping over the wetlands with relentless fury, the night sky roiling with dark, heavy clouds that seemed almost sentient in their approach, carrying with them torrents of rain so thick and fast that it sounded like rivers cascading onto my roof, each drop pounding the earth with a force that shook the trees, the reeds, and the fragile balance of the wetlands. And I awoke to the sound of water hammering against windows, the wind whipping through broken branches, and a low, ominous rumble that I instinctively knew was not thunder alone, but the sound of the earth itself responding to an overwhelming surge of liquid. And as I peered out from the safety of my porch, flashlight and binoculars forgotten in the adrenaline of the moment, I saw the devastation take form with a terrifying clarity. The trenches the HOA had carved for their ill-conceived road now transformed into raging channels. Torrents of muddy water rushing through the newly formed paths, scouring the soil with astonishing speed, uprooting what little vegetation remained, carrying debris and broken branches like flotsam on an unstoppable current. And the gravel and dirt that had been dumped to create the roadbed were now suspended in the floodwaters, sliding and washing away, creating mini landslides, collapsing embankments, and forming whirlpools in places where the water found sudden obstacles, while the heavy machinery, once symbols of control and human ambition, now sat trapped or partially submerged, bulldozers tilted precariously in mud, their treads spinning uselessly against the slick slope, backhoes half buried, doors ajar, cabins filling slowly with rainwater, and trucks that had attempted to carry materials now stranded, their wheels sinking deeper with every pulse of water, some pushed over entirely, floating briefly before wedging against debris, while the sound of cracking wood, snapping branches, and rushing water created a symphony of chaos that echoed across the wetlands, and the wildlife that had not fled earlier scrambled frantically, frogs and turtles clinging to whatever elevation they could find, birds beating through storm-laden air, wings soaked and weary, while the once calm pools shimmered violently under the downpour, waves rippling in unnatural patterns as water from uphill areas funneled into the wetlands, and I felt a cold mixture of awe and fear. Knowing that the sheer power of the storm was beyond human control, and yet in that raw display of nature's force, I also felt a profound sense of correction, as if the earth itself were rebalancing, punishing the arrogance that had dared to impose a road where it did not belong, and I grabbed my waterproof jacket and boots, venturing carefully into the storm, stepping onto the wooden deck that now shook under the pounding rain, observing as water levels rose, watching the trenches widen and deepen with each passing minute, photographing the flooded machinery, the collapsed embankments, the swirling currents that had formed where gravel had once tried to direct them, and every image I captured told a story of human presumption meeting natural consequence. The carefully constructed plans washed away, machines immobilized, earth reshaped violently yet predictably by forces we often ignore, and as the morning light began to filter weakly through the storm clouds, a pale, filtered gray illuminating the scene, the full scope of the disaster became terrifyingly clear, the road almost entirely erased, with only jagged ridges hinting at where it had been, deep gouges filled with rushing water, debris strewn across every inch, and the machinery that had symbolized progress now appeared abandoned, powerless against the storm, their bright yellow and orange paint dulled by mud and water, windows shattered in some cases, metal twisted, hydraulic lines leaking. And I stood on the porch, unable to tear my eyes away, feeling a strange combination of relief and sorrow, relief that the wetlands had survived in principle, that nature had demonstrated its resilience and supremacy, and sorrow for the destroyed equipment, the labor wasted, and the bitter realization that humans had little control in the face of such overwhelming force. And as the rain continued, I walked slowly along the edge of my property, boots sinking into saturated soil, feeling the churned mud give way underfoot, listening to the roar of water cascading through newly formed channels, the sound of small trees toppling into the flood, the violent splashes of displaced animals, the wind tugging at my jacket, and I noted the subtle changes in water flow, the way small pools merged, creating a chaotic network of streams that had once been flat wetlands, the smell of wet earth and decaying vegetation mixing with the metallic scent of machinery partially submerged. And I realized that in this moment, the wetlands were reclaiming their territory, correcting the human imposition, and reasserting the natural order. And I could see in slow motion the trucks and smaller equipment being moved by the flood, some sliding into deeper trenches, others tipped over completely, the roar of rushing water masking the creaks of stressed metal and snapping limbs. And I felt the raw power of water, the realization that it was simultaneously destroyer and preserver, reshaping the landscape while ensuring that the wetlands' function as a natural sponge was restored, absorbing the excess, slowing the flood, reclaiming the land. And I continued photographing, documenting every shift, every splash, every collapse, knowing that this evidence would prove both the folly of the road and the necessity of respecting natural wetlands. While the storm showed no sign of abating, each wave of rain intensifying the flow, small gullies deepening into channels, dirt sliding into water like sandcastles being dismantled. And yet amidst the destruction, I felt a profound, almost spiritual sense of balance, that nature, though violent, was also corrective, and that what humans had tried to impose recklessly could be undone by the patient, relentless power of water. And as I finally stepped back onto the porch, soaked, muddy, exhausted, heart racing, eyes wide from the spectacle, I realized that the lesson had been delivered in full, clear, and undeniable. Wetlands are not obstacles to be bulldozed. Their role is critical, their power immense. And the storm, in its indiscriminate fury, had reminded us of what generations before had understood instinctively. And while I did not feel joy in witnessing the chaos, I felt a deep sense of respect, of acknowledgement that nature, when pushed, will respond with force, and that the wetlands had not been conquered but had spoken, and the scars of the flood, the displaced machines, the torn-up soil, the channels carved by rushing water, all bore witness to that truth. And I stood there long after the rain slowed, listening to the murmur of water retreating into normal channels, watching birds cautiously return, frogs croak hesitantly, reeds sway once more. And I knew that the message was clear, that progress without understanding and respect for nature invites disaster, that the road was no longer a threat, that the wetlands had reclaimed authority over their own space, and that the battle between human presumption and natural law had been won, at least in this instance, by the patient, unyielding, restorative power of the earth itself. And I felt the first true calm in weeks, standing on my porch, watching the water settle, listening to the restored rhythms of the wetlands, knowing that although the fight was not over entirely, nature had corrected what humans had tried to impose, and the lesson, brutal and magnificent, was undeniable. In the days following the storm, the full scope of the disaster became horrifyingly, vividly apparent, as if nature itself had pulled back the curtain to reveal the consequences of human arrogance. And the HOA, who had once proceeded with unchecked confidence, now scrambled like a cornered animal, emails flying between board members, fingers hovering anxiously over keyboards, phone lines ringing incessantly as contractors, insurance agents, and legal advisors were called into action. Their previous assurances of progress now drowned in a flood of complaints, warnings, and accountability. And I watched with a mixture of vindication and weary exhaustion as their carefully laid plans dissolved under the weight of documentation, inspections, and citations. The local authorities moving with deliberate, legal precision to cite violations, issuing orders for immediate remediation, demanding detailed reports, photographs, and plans for restoring the wetlands to their prior state. Their language formal yet unmistakably firm, emphasizing that no further disruption would be tolerated. And I found myself deeply involved, walking through the saturated earth with gloves and boots, assessing the landscape, measuring water flow, mapping erosion gullies, documenting plant displacement, and noting areas where sediment had been improperly deposited, my camera capturing every scar, every subtle change in elevation, every flattened reed, every displaced frog or turtle. While I coordinated with environmental officers, explaining the critical importance of each area, suggesting restoration methods based on my years of experience, detailing how reeds needed to be replanted at precise intervals to restore natural water absorption, how sediment removal had to be carefully conducted to avoid further destabilization, how wildlife needed temporary refuges to recover before reintroducing them to restored areas. And I became almost a full-time caretaker of my own land and a consultant to the authorities, guiding them through the chaos the HOA had created, showing them where small dams had formed unnaturally, where temporary pools could become permanent hazards, where erosion gullies threatened to expand if left unchecked. And the HOA, once confident, now watched helplessly as their plans were unraveled, receiving letters of violation, warnings of fines, and demands for compliance. Their calls to contractors often ending in frustration as the contractors, hired hastily before the storm, admitted that much of the work they had done was either destroyed or would require expensive correction to meet legal and environmental standards. And while they panicked over bureaucracy, insurance, and reputations, I focused on the wetlands themselves, walking slowly through the mud, feeling the saturated earth give slightly under each step, listening to the faint croaks of frogs returning cautiously to shallow pools, noting the shimmer of water across flattened reeds, the first hesitant shoots of new growth emerging from disturbed soil. And I worked methodically, planting reeds in neat clusters, redirecting small channels to restore natural flow, moving debris carefully to avoid harming wildlife, and in some areas creating temporary barriers to prevent further erosion, all the while photographing the progress, documenting the restoration with precise attention, labeling each photo with date, location, and description, ensuring that the entire process was recorded for posterity and accountability. And as the days turned into weeks, the wetlands slowly began to show signs of recovery. Subtle at first, the gentle sway of replanted reeds, small ripples in the water as turtles and frogs cautiously returned, the soft hum of insects emerging from the mud, dragonflies hovering over tiny puddles that reflected morning light, birds tentatively visiting the trees and reeds, calling in familiar patterns, and I felt a profound sense of connection and relief, seeing the ecosystem respond, almost as if acknowledging that care had been taken, that the natural balance was being respected, while the HOA continued to struggle with insurance claims, frustrated contractors, and repeated visits from local authorities insisting on full compliance with restoration orders, emails escalating in tone as deadlines approached, the language increasingly desperate, promises of future monitoring and adherence offered in words that rang hollow. And yet I knew that every photograph I had taken, every detailed note I had made, every report I had submitted now held power, proof that the damage was their responsibility and that restoration could not be delayed. And as I walked through the wetlands one morning, feeling the soggy earth underfoot, I noticed the first small signs of true recovery. Reeds standing upright, their green tips vibrant against the brown of mud, small pools of water beginning to mirror the sky rather than the churned soil, tiny frogs hopping cautiously along the edges, their croaks sounding like a tentative chorus, insects buzzing once more, and the air filled with the clean, earthy scent of wet soil and reborn vegetation. And I realized that months of vigilance, nights spent documenting, days spent supervising and planting, were slowly paying off, that the wetlands were healing, and that the battle to protect them, though exhausting, had been worthwhile. And I continued methodically, walking each section, planting where necessary, clearing debris, observing water flow, checking for signs of erosion, noting where wildlife had returned, photographing and labeling everything, sending updates to authorities to demonstrate compliance and progress. And I felt a deep, almost spiritual satisfaction in seeing the life return, knowing that the balance had been restored not by machines, not by permits, not by bureaucracy, but through careful attention, respect, and perseverance. And the HOA, now subdued and chastened, could only watch as their initial arrogance had been undone, the wetlands standing resilient, teaching a lesson that could not be ignored. As days passed and sunlight warmed the saturated earth, the water slowed to gentle ripples, reeds swayed in the breeze, frogs called in unison, Birds settled among the trees, dragonflies danced above, and even small turtles re-emerged from hidden pools, moving with cautious confidence across restored banks, while I walked among them, documenting, observing, planting, repairing, feeling the rhythm of the wetlands return, understanding that the scars would remain as a reminder but that life, resilient and patient, could overcome human intrusion when given care and attention. And by the end of several weeks, the wetlands looked almost as they had before the construction, alive and functional. The water flowing naturally, the vegetation re-established, wildlife cautiously thriving, and I finally allowed myself a moment to breathe, standing on the edge of the restored marsh, listening to the chorus of frogs and birds, watching water shimmer across the shallow pools, feeling mud squish beneath my boots, and knowing that although the battle had been long, arduous, and at times lonely, the wetlands had survived, the balance restored, and the land I had loved for decades now resilient once more. A testament to vigilance, respect, and the irreplaceable power of nature when defended with care, patience, and determination. And in that quiet, muddy triumph, I understood that protection of life, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, was a responsibility worth every sleepless night, every exhausted day, and every ounce of effort invested. For the wetlands were not just land. They were living history, a fragile sanctuary, and a legacy that could endure when tended with knowledge, patience, and unwavering dedication. And as I watched the sun glint off tiny droplets on the reeds, frogs diving into the water, dragonflies skimming the surface, and birds returning to their familiar perches, I felt a profound, lasting sense of accomplishment, knowing that the wetlands, once threatened, were now healing, thriving, and resilient, and that the HOA had finally been held accountable for their reckless actions, and though the scars of human interference remained faintly visible, the wetlands had reclaimed their life, their function, and their beauty, and I continued to walk, plant, photograph, observe, and repair, a guardian of the land, content in the knowledge that vigilance and care could preserve not only property, but life itself. After weeks of relentless vigilance, documentation, restoration, and monitoring, the HOA finally backed off, their arrogance tempered by the undeniable consequences of both natural forces and regulatory oversight, their emails growing less frequent, their phone calls shorter, their promises to comply with restoration requirements increasingly reluctant yet inevitable, as inspections confirmed that the wetlands had been significantly impacted, but were now being returned to their functional state. And in that long-awaited silence, I felt a profound sense of relief, knowing that my property, my sanctuary, and the delicate ecosystem I had nurtured for decades were once again secure, the machinery removed, the scars of human intrusion slowly healing under the patient guidance of replanted reeds, stabilized soil, and returning wildlife. And I took time to walk the land, boots sinking into soft, muddy earth, camera in hand but now used more for observation than for evidence, photographing the subtle progress of recovery, the gentle sway of new reeds, the cautious return of frogs, the tentative hopping of turtles across restored banks, dragonflies skimming over shallow pools that reflected the soft morning light, and birds returning to familiar perches, calling in the same rhythmic choruses that had lulled me to sleep for years, each sound a comforting confirmation that life was resilient when tended with care and respect. And I began sharing my story with neighbors, many of whom had watched from a distance during the battle, some fearful of HOA retribution, others quietly supportive, and I emphasized the importance of observing, documenting, and advocating for natural spaces, explaining in detail how wetlands function as sponges, slowing floodwaters, preventing erosion, and supporting complex ecosystems, and how human interference, even when well-intentioned in the name of progress, can lead to catastrophic consequences when it ignores natural laws. And as I spoke, I saw understanding bloom in their eyes, some nodding in agreement, some taking notes, some inspired to advocate for their own properties. And I realized that the lessons extended far beyond my own land, that the struggle had become an example, a demonstration that stewardship, patience, and vigilance could safeguard not just property but the intricate balance of life itself. and as the weeks turned into months, the wetlands continued to recover, subtle yet unmistakable signs of resilience appearing in every corner, small rivulets forming natural channels again, pools of water stabilizing, reeds growing taller and stronger, frogs and turtles resuming their roles within the ecosystem, insects buzzing, dragonflies patrolling, birds nesting once more. The air filled with the familiar scent of wet earth and growing vegetation, and I felt a deep, almost spiritual satisfaction in knowing that the land had survived, not by human dominance but by respect for natural balance, and by the willingness to fight not for convenience or ego, but for life itself. And in quiet moments on my porch, looking over the restored marshes, I reflected on the lessons the flood had taught, that nature is both punishment and protection, capable of demonstrating consequences when human stubbornness overreaches, yet also capable of healing, of reclaiming, of restoring equilibrium when given opportunity and respect. And I considered how easy it is for humans to assume control, to bulldoze, to impose artificial order, forgetting that some things like wetlands, rivers, forests, and the creatures that inhabit them cannot be tamed without cost, that the consequences may arrive suddenly, violently, and indiscriminately. And I felt gratitude that in my case, the lesson was delivered without irreversible loss, that the flood, though destructive, had preserved the long-term integrity of the ecosystem, and I made a silent vow to continue sharing the knowledge I had gained, to advocate for environmental awareness, and to teach anyone who would listen that human ambition must coexist with the natural world, not dominate it, for the alternative is always disaster. And as I walked slowly along the restored wetland edges, feeling the soft mud beneath my boots, listening to the frogs' cautious choruses, watching dragonflies skim the surface of still reflective water, and observing birds perched in newly stabilized reeds, I recognized a profound truth. The battle had been about more than ownership or property lines. It had been about understanding, respect, responsibility, and humility, and that humility is a lesson that even the most stubborn individuals must learn sooner or later. And as I paused to photograph a small turtle making its way carefully across a shallow pool, the sun breaking through scattered clouds to illuminate the scene in soft, golden light, I felt a sense of harmony returning not just to the wetlands, but within myself. A reconciliation of human effort and natural resilience, and I realized that the story of the flood, the struggle with the HOA, the nights spent documenting every trench and mudslide, the weeks of restoration, and the cautious return of wildlife would remain with me as a permanent reminder that life cannot be controlled recklessly, that consequences are inevitable when nature is ignored, and that protecting what is irreplaceable requires courage, patience, and unwavering commitment. And in the end, I understood fully that some land is untamable, some ecosystems are inviolable, and while human stubbornness can impose momentary change, the enduring power of nature ensures that equilibrium is restored, sometimes violently, sometimes gradually, but always inevitably. And as I looked across the wetlands now teeming with life, I felt gratitude, humility, and resolve, knowing that my fight had preserved not just land, but heritage, sanctuary, and the profound reminder that in the intricate dance between humans and nature, respect, vigilance, and care are not optional, they are essential. And I knew that from this day forward, I would continue to stand as guardian of the wetlands, sharing the story, advocating for balance, and ensuring that the lessons learned would resonate far beyond my own property, a living testament to the power, patience, and indomitable spirit of nature itself. And as evening fell, casting a warm glow over the gently swaying reeds, the croaking chorus of frogs, and the reflective pools of water, I allowed myself a moment of quiet contemplation, acknowledging that the flood had been both punishment and protection, a teacher, a corrector, and a reminder that some things are always bigger than human ambition, and that some land, some ecosystems, cannot be tamed without consequences. And with that knowledge, I felt an enduring connection to the wetlands, a bond strengthened through struggle, restoration, and unwavering respect. and I understood that the story I had lived and documented would serve as a guide for anyone who might one day confront similar challenges, emphasizing that stewardship, vigilance, and humility are the keys to protecting what is precious and irreplaceable, and that in defending the balance of life itself, the rewards are immeasurable, both for the land and for the human spirit willing to act in its defense.